Hi everyone, thank you for watching Gaffer and Gear. In today's episode, I'm going to take a look at the projection lens that Astera have made to work with their PlutoFresnel. Now, I think this is optically the best zoom spot that I've ever used. In fact, I would go as far as to say that if you calibrate your distance correctly, this can actually outperform the bulk of fixed diameter projection lenses. Okay, let's start off with the regular disclaimers. Astera are not paying me any money for this episode, but they did send me all of this product for free and I do get to keep it. So technically that is a paid endorsement and that's why you get the warning at the start of the episode. All right, let's go through a bit of a walkthrough of the product. Now this product can do incredibly sharp projections over a long distance. And not only that, it can cleanly defocus. It doesn't matter whether you're doing a wide projection or a tight projection. You can get insanely crisp optics with very minimal chromatic aberration. The same thing applies if you're working in close range. What makes this possible is the unique design of the lens. It has two focusing rings. The ring that's closest to the light is used to set your distance between the light and the subject. It is very critical that you get this right. Now on this ring, it has some markings that would be at home on a camera lens. It has your macro and your infinity markings, and all of the other numbers correlate to distance in meters from the light to the subject. So to get your best possible optics out of this lens system, you need to dial in the distance that you have the light from the subject. Now, if you don't do that, if you just randomly try to find your focus point, you can get very crisp cuts. But when you defocus, you'll get a load of chromatic aberration. So the rear focus ring calibrates the lens for the distance that you're working at, and the front focus ring does your artistic focusing and defocusing. If you get this right, you get incredibly good defocusing. Now the center ring adjusts the diameter of your beam between 36 degrees and 16 degrees. Okay, let's go through the pros and cons, starting with the cons first to get those out of the way. And I think the biggest con for this system for a lot of people is going to be its weight and price compared to say a Forza 60C with its projector mounts. Now the next con for me is to do with the optics. If you're working within 3 meters and you want to be at 36 degrees, you're not going to get your entire range of focusing and defocusing. So if you find yourself in that situation, just drop it back to about 33 degrees and you'll get your full focus range back. Now, if you want to work in really close, the same thing applies. If you go within a meter, regardless of the diameter that you set for your beam, you're not going to get all of your optical sweetness. You're not going to get all of the focusing and defocusing range, but it is something that you can work around quite easily. The real big negative for me is this uses E-size Gobos, and I don't have a library of these. Now the last negative is that this doesn't have an iris available for it, and it doesn't have an iris slot. Quite simply, Astera couldn't make an iris small enough that worked optically well. But luckily the guys at Rosco have a solution. So a very big thank you to the guys at Rosco for rushing this product to me to get it into the review. So essentially, these are Gobos with circles at different diameters or apertures. Now the big advice given to me from Astera was buy the glass ones, don't buy the metal ones. The glass ones will optically work way better. All right, so what are the pros and cons with these? Well, the cons are obviously that an iris is faster to work with. The next con is you can't have an iris and a Gobo at the same time because you've only got the one slot. But the big pro with these is you get a perfect circle. Now, before we get the test underway, I just want to show you that there is a little bit of a donut around the beam. So if I expose into the dark areas a little bit, you can just see it. And if I do a crazy exposure, you can see what I'm talking about. But I honestly don't think this is ever going to be an issue. Now this is the widest aperture Gobo, and this is how well it works with the blades. Now let's have a look at defocusing. Now I've got the projector at 3 meters, and there's no perceivable chromatic aberration here. This is the next sized aperture down. This is the second smallest aperture. And this is the tightest aperture. Now I've got the lights on here just to remind you how small we're going. So could you use this to light a circular logo on a product? Well, absolutely. And I'm doing this at a distance of about 1 meter. But not only that, you can cleanly defocus it. Now, if you want to buy these glass aperture Gobos from Rosco, I'm going to save you a lot of time searching for them online. So here's the description or catalog number that was on my invoice. And then the corresponding numbers: 77725, 77726, 77727, and 77728. Let's start going through the pros now. And a big concern with me initially is this isn't a mount, it's a drop-in. So I was concerned about stray light getting into the gaps. But this has so much optical masking that is not going to happen. So that is a pro for me. Now, the build quality is definitely a pro. And because it's built like a camera lens, you can easily do your focusing. So you're not having to undo a lens barrel, reposition it, let go of the lens barrel and hope that it locks in the same spot that you just had it. If you want to get a fine focus, it really is easy to adjust. And it's got just enough friction in there that if you had this hanging directly downwards, it's not going to trombone and change your adjustments. Now, the next big plus, and get ready to give me a big hallelujah, is you can rotate the barrel. So not only can we quickly adjust the angle of our Gobos, but we can also change the orientation of our cutter blades. Another thing that's impressive with this projection mount is how even the beam is, and how perfectly consistent color distribution is. The next big pro for me is the Gobos and all 4 cutter blades are on very similar optical planes. Now, one thing I've really missed with bow and mount projectors is the ability to use the projector in conjunction with the zoom. This enables you to feather off the edges of your Gobos and feather off the edges of your cuts. The next pro for me is the blades can cut well over the center of the projection. This enables the individual blades to be used on extreme angles. And compared to every other projection mount I've got, there is minimal bouncing off the lens barrel. On my other projectors, if you cut the projection in half, you can clearly see the rest of the lens barrel, which is often green. Now, this isn't completely eliminated, but it's very, very minimal. That means we're not introducing any hues, so we've got good white point accuracy and good CCTs. Now, the 2 big pros for me is how sharp this can project and how cleanly it can defocus. Okay, let's go through price and what you get. Now, this is relatively new, so there's not a lot of listings online yet, but I have seen it listed for around $830 to $840 US. Okay, so for that money, of course, you get the lens. Now, the lens is actually a metal constructed barrel. It is really solid, and you've got a point here for your safety connections. You also get a lens cap. Now, the next thing you get in the kit is your Gobo holder, which is E-series, and you get a little kit of 4 Gobos. So let's start off the testing by seeing how well this would work on tabletop photography. So I'm going to do the testing to start off with at a distance of 1 meter. Now, let's not mess around here. Let's do a worst case scenario, a white packet. Okay, because the problem with a white packet is you've got nowhere to hide your chromatic aberration. So if you've ever done product photography and you've got a white product, you know exactly what I mean. Your poorer projection mounts will definitely let you down. Now, here's the thing I found from my own experience using this on set. You definitely don't want to go within 1 meter. It'll still work if you're within 1 meter. The thing is, you don't have the optical sweetness, you don't have the range of defocusing on your cuts, for example. So you definitely want to be at least 1 meter back. Now, here's what I found with that. I'm used to working, say, with my projector mounts about that far away from the subject that we're filming or the product that we're filming. Now, on the shoot that I had recently, all of those projectors that were in that tight, they all got kicked or bumped at least once during the shoot, because you've got a food stylist that's got to work. And sometimes they can't get their plate in, or sometimes they're doing their work, they turn around and bump your projector, and then you've got to reset everything. This didn't get bumped because it was just that little bit further away. It allowed everybody to get in and do their work. And using it at 1 meter, I didn't find it difficult at all. Let's take a look at the tests. At a distance of 1 meter with the lens set to 36 degrees, this is the sharpest focus I can get. But if I squeeze it down a little bit to say 33 degrees, then I get my entire focus range at 1 meter. Now let's run through the defocus range. And it has an extremely clean defocusing. Now let's do the same test again, but this time we'll turn off every light in the room so you can see every bit of chromatic aberration that's in this lens. Now just note there is a bit of bounce off the apple box, which is affecting the shadows down the bottom. Now let's do the same testing again, but this time with the lens at the other extreme, 16 degrees. As you can see, the blade cuts are very sharp. And it has an extremely clean defocusing. But let's do that test again, this time with all the other lights off. There is the slightest hint of chromatic aberration, but the defocusing is extremely clean. Now let's do the same testing again with Gobo patterns, starting off with 33 degrees. And just a reminder, we are getting a bit of bounce off the apple box, which is affecting the shadows. So to get a better idea of the projection, look at the cuts towards the top of the product. Now let's try the same thing with 16 degrees. And just a reminder, we are getting a bit of bounce off the apple box, which is affecting the shadows. So I'm going to test the lens on every marked diameter. So that's 36 degrees, 30 degrees, 25 degrees, 20 degrees, and 16 degrees. I'll be testing them all at 3 meters away from the wall. Now, at the start of each of the tests, I have a new chapter. So you can skip directly to the chapter that you want to get information for. Now, also at the start of every chapter is the brightness information for that beam diameter. And that brightness information is taken at a distance of 3 meters. Okay, let's start my testing off with the lens set to 36 degrees. And these are the brightness readings at a distance of 3 meters. Now just note the ISO is set to 800 for these f-stop readings, and these are the readings for 36 degrees only. The more you spot the beam up, the brighter it gets. Now the beam is very even with a very even distribution of light regardless of the color that you dial in. Now I just want to point something out here. I'm exposing into the dark areas more than I normally would on purpose at the start of this test, because using this lens at 3 meters with a 36-degree beam angle is right on the edge of the optics. Now here on the blade cuts, you can see what I'm talking about. There's a bit of ghosting on the edges, but only if you're exposing into your dark areas. Now at 36 degrees, this doesn't show up if the light's 4.5 meters or further away. Now let's have a look at the focusing and defocusing. Now let's take a closer look to see if there's any chromatic aberration issues. Now from this point onwards, I'm exposing correctly. And as you can see, the haloing is no longer an issue. And it has an extremely clean defocusing. Now let's check for any concaving or convexing on our cuts. And as you can see, there's pretty much nothing. Set to 36 degrees at 3 meters, Gobos are right on the edge of being able to be focused. But as you can see, it has very clean defocusing. Now let's take a closer, more critical look. And you can see there is a little bit of chromatic aberration here. But if you're close enough to see the chromatic aberration, you're close enough to see the imperfections in the cutting of the Gobo. Now let's have a look at straight line patterns or bars. And there's absolutely no problems here. Let's take a closer, more critical look. And as you can see, the defocusing is very clean. At 36 degrees at this distance, circular patterns do have a little bit of haloing around them if you're exposing into your dark areas. But if you're exposing correctly, this isn't an issue. And as you can see, you've got plenty of range for defocusing. Now let's take a closer critical look. And as you can see, it defocuses very clean. With circular patterns, there is a little bit more chromatic aberration than on straight patterns. But if you're shooting in an environment that has ambient light, I don't think this would ever show up. With random patterns, it's not possible to get a perfectly even focus right across the projection. But there is a lot of scope for defocusing. When you take a closer look, you can see just how clean the projector defocuses. Now let's take a look at using the Fresnel focus mechanism to soft focus the edges of a Gobo projection. And the Gobos and the blades are very closely aligned on their focal planes. Now let's take a look with the lens set to 30 degrees. And all of this testing is done at a distance of 3 meters. These are the brightness readings, and as you can see, it is brighter than it was at 36 degrees. Just like at 36 degrees, it has a very even distribution of light. Regardless of the CCT or colour you dial in, the distribution is also even. Once again, blade cuts are very sharp, regardless of CCT or colour dialed in. And focusing and defocusing is very clean. When we take a closer look, you can see there is almost no chromatic aberration. And bear in mind, this is a zoom lens, not a fixed diameter lens. Now let's check for any concaving or convexing in the cuts. Gobo projections are not perfectly sharp from edge to edge, but they're so sharp they're going to look in focus on camera. And once again, defocusing is incredibly clean. Let's take a closer look, and with straight line patterns, there is virtually no chromatic aberration. Straight line or bar patterns project with no issues at all, and when you defocus, there's nothing crazy going on with the light emitters. Once again, on close inspection, you can see there is virtually no chromatic aberration, and the defocusing is very clean. Circular patterns are where this projector is at its weakest. However, if you're exposing correctly, they still look good, and they tend to defocus with minimal issues. Upon closer inspection, you can see there is some chromatic aberration here. But if you're working with ambient light, I don't think it's going to be noticeable. And there is a little bit of haloing if you expose into the shadows. But once again, if you're working in a room with ambient light, you're never going to see this. Random patterns project rather well, and focus and defocus without any issues. Now let's have a look at softening the edge using the Fresnel flood spot mechanism. And most importantly to me, the focal plane relationship between the Gobo and the cutters is very fine. Now let's take a look with the lens set to 25 degrees. And once again, we're doing our testing at a distance of 3 meters. These are the brightness results. Once again, regardless of the CCT or colour you dial in, the beam is nice and even. Again, blade cuts are extremely sharp, regardless of colour dialed in. And you guessed it, it has very clean defocusing. Even upon critical close inspection, it's very hard to fault. Gobo projections are nice and sharp. What does look like concaving and convexing here is my camera lens. Defocusing once again is very clean on straight line patterns. Once again, there are no problems with bar patterns. At no point through the focusing do any of the LEDs appear. On close inspection, you can see there's very minimal chromatic aberration. Circular patterns project better than they have on the previous diameters during the testing, and have a huge range for focusing and defocusing. But you can see on defocusing some chromatic aberration differences between the centre and the edge of the beam. On sharp focus, chromatic aberration really is at a minimum, but it is still there. However, in a real-world situation, I don't think you'd see it at all. If you expose into your blacks, the circular patterns still have haloing. But once again, if you've got any ambient light, you won't see this. Random patterns do have a bit of haloing if you expose into the shadows. But again, with correct exposure, it's not going to be noticeable. And there is a massive range for focusing and defocusing. Upon close inspection, you can see just how sharp the projection is. Let's have a look at defocusing the edges with the Fresnel flood spot. And once again, the relationship between the focal plane of the Gobo and the cutter blades is very fine. Now let's take a look with the lens set to 20 degrees. And again, this testing is done at a distance of 3 meters. Here are the brightness levels, and we're getting some very usable exposures here. Again, we have a beam with beautiful distribution of light and colour. Blade cuts are extremely sharp. Regardless of CCT or colour dialed in. And again, defocusing is very clean. Even upon close inspection, it's very hard to criticise it. Gobo projections still don't have an even focus from edge to edge, but they're way more than acceptable. And the defocusing is extremely clean, even if you're working in close. Straight line patterns represent no problem at all, even when fully defocused. The trend seems to be with circular patterns that you get better results if the lens is set to a tighter diameter. With circular patterns, there is some chromatic aberration difference between the centre and the edge of the beam, which can lead to a hue difference if you're working extremely out of focus. On sharp focus, aberration is extremely minimal. And once again, there is a bit of a halo if you're exposing into your dark areas. But if you're working in a room with ambient light, you're never going to see this. Random patterns do have a bit of a halo if you're exposing into your dark areas. But if you're working in a room with ambient light, you're never going to see this, and you're never going to see it if you expose or have the dimming set correctly. Once again, we have a massive range of focusing and defocusing. Upon close inspection, you can see just how clean the projection and the defocusing is. Let's have a look at softening off the edge of the beam with the Fresnel spot. And once again, the focal plane relationship between the cutters and the Gobo is extremely fine. Now let's take a look with the lens set to 16 degrees. And again, this testing is done at a range of 3 meters. Here are the brightness readings, and because we are at maximum spot, these are the brightest results we're going to get. At 16 degrees, the beam is once again very even. Distribution of colour across the beam is near perfect. Blade cuts are incredibly sharp. And as you can see, you've got plenty of range for defocusing. At a distance of 3 meters, Gobo projections are really sharp. Upon close inspection, you can see just how clean the defocusing is. Straight line patterns project really well, with no concaving or convexing. And as you can see, there's no issues with defocusing. It looks like there's no chromatic aberration at all. But upon really close inspection, you can see that it's there. Again, with ambient light in the room, you cannot see this chromatic aberration. With circular patterns, focus across the beam at 3 meters is a little bit uneven, but it's still pretty good, and you've got a massive scope for defocusing. However, if I expose into the shadows, you can see that there is some haloing. But in my opinion, if you're working in a room with ambient light, you're not going to see any of these issues. Let's take a closer look now at those issues. And now the same closer look with ambient light. Now let's take a look at the spectrometer data for the light set at 3200 Kelvin and at 5600 Kelvin with the projector on its tightest beam of 16 degrees. When I dialed in 3200 Kelvin, I got 3170 with an SSI score of 86. The TN30 colour testing results were 95% average colour accuracy with an average 101% colour saturation. With the CRI scores, only R12 was below 90. This is the spectrum distribution. And the white point was very close to perfect with a delta UV of plus 0.0006. When I dialed in 5600 Kelvin set to 16 degrees, I got 5557 with an SSI score of 73. The TN30 colour testing results came in with a 93% average colour accuracy and an average 101% colour saturation. With the CRI scores, only R12 was below 90. This is a spectrum distribution. And the white point came in with a delta UV of plus 0.0030. So if you're working to the Planckian curve, that would make this light slightly green to lessen the equivalent of a 1/8 correction gel. However, if you're working to the daylight curve, this is almost spot on perfect. Now let's take a look at the spectrometer data with the light set to 3200 Kelvin and 5600 Kelvin with the projector mount set to its widest beam angle of 36 degrees. When I dialed in 3200 Kelvin, I got 3146 with an SSI score of 87. The TM30 colour testing results were 95% average colour accuracy with an average 101% colour saturation. With the CRI scores, only R9 was below 90. This is the spectrum distribution. And the white point came in with a delta UV of plus 0.0007, which is very close to perfect. When I dialed in 5600 Kelvin, I got 5513 with an SSI score of 73. The TM30 colour testing results were 93% average colour accuracy with an average 101% colour saturation. With the CRI scores, only R12 was below 90. This is the spectrum distribution. And the white point came in with a delta UV of plus 0.0026. So if you're working to the Planckian curve, this light would have a green hue to almost but not quite a 1/8 correction gel. But if you're working to the daylight curve, it's very close to perfect. Okay, so just my closing thoughts. Well done to Astera for going to all the effort of designing an optical attachment completely from scratch to work with the light, and I think the results have paid off. Now, personally for me, I wasn't all that interested in the light. All of the negatives I had in the review were literally my negatives, and they outweighed the pros for me, but this makes this worthwhile. I wouldn't be surprised if people that thought the same thing will now go out and buy the light just to get the projector mount. I really do think it's that good. Thank you for watching Gaffer and Gear. Take care, everybody.